Since its establishment in 1944, the leadership of the World Bank has been exclusively held by individuals from the United States. From its first president, Eugene Meyer, to its current leader, Ajay Banga, the institution has consistently adhered to an unwritten rule that its top position is reserved for an American citizen. This practice underscores the significant influence the United States wields within the organization, a power reinforced by its status as the largest stakeholder. Decisions related to development funding and structural reforms frequently align with a neoliberal economic framework preferred by Western nations. However, this approach has drawn criticism for enforcing austerity measures and privatization policies that can deepen inequality and obstruct sustainable development in the Global South. The lack of diverse leadership contributes to perceptions that the World Bank operates as a Western instrument rather than a genuinely global institution. For countries in the Global South, which constitute the majority of the bank's beneficiaries, the absence of leadership that represents their lived experiences and perspectives raises concerns about authentic representation. For instance, many World Bank projects have faced allegations of prioritizing resource extraction and trade liberalization that benefit multinational corporations rather than initiatives that directly address local development needs. Shifting focus to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. This institution has played a central role in global financial management since its founding in 1944. Much like the World Bank, the IMF has maintained an exclusive leadership tradition, with Europeans consistently occupying the position of managing director. From its first leader, Camille Gut of Belgium, to the current managing director, Kristalina Georgieva of Bulgaria, this leadership pattern highlights the enduring dominance of Western nations within the institution. The IMF's European leadership has promoted economic policies grounded in Western fiscal conservatism, often emphasizing austerity, privatization, and economic liberalization. These policies tend to reflect the priorities of advanced European economies rather than the developmental needs of nations in the Global South. Despite the IMF's stated global mission, its leadership does not reflect the diversity of its member states, particularly those most affected by its policies. The long-standing partnership between the United States and Europe in overseeing both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has created a governance framework that consolidates decision-making power within the Western Bloc. Leaders of the BRICS nations have repeatedly called for reforms in global financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, arguing that these organizations should better represent emerging economies. For example, at the 6th BRICS Summit in 2014, leaders voiced their dissatisfaction over the failure to implement the 2010 IMF reforms, contending that this inaction undermines the IMF's credibility, legitimacy, and overall effectiveness. In October 2024, Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov criticized the IMF and the World Bank, asserting that these institutions do not serve the interests of BRICS countries. He advocated for the creation of alternative institutions designed to meet the specific needs of these nations, arguing that the current global financial system remains dominated by Western nations and fails to provide adequate support for BRICS members. Similarly, during the 16th BRICS Summit in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva emphasized the significance of the bloc's new development bank, NDB, as an alternative to the existing financial institutions, which he described as failing. He also stressed the importance of developing independent payment systems to reduce reliance on traditional financial mechanisms controlled by Western countries. Critics of former U.S. President Donald Trump have voiced concerns about his administration's stance on the IMF. A particularly significant critique comes from Robert H. Wade, a global political economy professor at the London School of Economics. Wade points out that the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 blueprint proposes that the United States withdraw from both the IMF and the World Bank. The rationale behind this recommendation is that such a move would reclaim approximately $770 billion for the U.S. Treasury, allowing those funds to be redirected toward domestic priorities such as tax reductions. Wade highlights the irony of this stance, as critics have long argued that these institutions disproportionately serve U.S. interests, whereas the Trump administration portrays the country as a victim of these organizations. He warns that withdrawing from these institutions could erode U.S. soft power and destabilize the global economy. Similarly, Martin Muley, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, warns that while the IMF and World Bank largely remained unaffected during Trump's first term due to skilled diplomatic maneuvering by their leaders, A second Trump administration might push these institutions to align more closely with U.S. geopolitical interests. Such pressure could threaten their independence and effectiveness. He cautions that politicizing these institutions could result in tensions among member nations, ultimately undermining their credibility. Furthermore, Chatham House has raised concerns about the broader implications of Trump's policies on both domestic institutions and international alliances. The organization warns that weakening these institutions could diminish confidence in U.S. governance and lead to long-term negative effects on both the U.S. and global economies. The analysis suggests that while some of Trump's economic policies may appear beneficial in the short term, their long-term consequences could be far-reaching and potentially harmful. Many nations have grown increasingly discontent with global financial institutions, questioning whether their lending practices truly support sustainable economic growth. A fair loan should include reasonable interest rates, flexible repayment schedules, transparent terms, minimal conditionalities, and a focus on long-term development. Conversely, unfair loans burden recipients with excessive interest rates, rigid repayment structures, unclear agreements, and policy conditions that may lead to economic distress and loss of sovereignty. The IMF primarily focuses on macroeconomic stabilization through structural adjustment programs, which typically emphasize austerity, privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization. While these measures aim to control inflation and reduce deficits, they often undermine national sovereignty and can contribute to rising poverty and unemployment. A standardized approach to economic policy may fail to account for the unique circumstances of individual nations, potentially fostering long-term dependency without addressing the root causes of economic instability. In contrast, the BRICS New Development Bank, established in 2015, offers a different model by financing infrastructure, renewable energy, and sustainable projects under more flexible and borrower-friendly terms. Unlike the IMF, the NDB imposes fewer policy conditions, granting borrowing nations greater economic autonomy. By prioritizing regional cooperation and transparency, the NDB aims to provide tailored solutions that align with the specific needs of its member states. However, as a relatively new institution, the NDB still faces challenges in ensuring equitable representation among BRICS members. BRICS nations continue to push for financial reforms that reflect the economic realities of the modern era. They argue that existing structures, such as the IMF and the World Trade Organization, WTO, disproportionately serve wealthier nations and fail to accommodate the priorities of the Global South. Their demands include revising the IMF's quota system to grant emerging economies greater influence and restoring the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism. As dissatisfaction with Western-led financial institutions grows, many Global South nations are considering establishing alternative structures to address their specific needs. By May 1998, nationwide demonstrations in Indonesia escalated into violent riots, particularly in Jakarta and other urban centers. Protesters targeted symbols of wealth and authority, resulting in significant property destruction and looting, much of which was directed at the Chinese-Indonesian community. In response, the government deployed military forces to quell the unrest, leading to numerous casualties. Estimates of the death toll vary, with some sources reporting over 1,000 fatalities. The combination of public outrage, the economic crisis, and IMF-imposed austerity measures eroded confidence in President Suharto's leadership. Mounting pressure ultimately forced him to step down on May 21, 1998, marking the end of his 31-year rule. The turmoil of 1998 signified the beginning of Indonesia's Reformasi era, which introduced democratic reforms and promoted greater transparency in governance. However, the economic crisis and the IMF-driven austerity left a lasting impact on Indonesian society, shaping public perception of international financial institutions and influencing economic policy decisions for years to come. In January 1977, Egypt witnessed widespread civil unrest, commonly known as the Bread Riots, following the government's decision to cut subsidies on essential food items. This policy, aimed at securing financial assistance from institutions such as the IMF, resulted in a sudden and drastic increase in the prices of staple goods, including bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil. The sharp price hikes triggered mass protests in major cities such as Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez. The demonstrations began on January 18, 1977, when workers in industrial hubs like Helwan initiated strikes. The movement quickly gained momentum as students and other citizens joined in, with protesters chanting against the government and its economic policies. As tensions rose, Demonstrators targeted institutions linked to state authority and wealth, including police stations, government buildings, and luxury hotels. Public transportation was also attacked, leading to extensive property damage. In response, President Anwar Sadat ordered the military to restore order on January 20th. This intervention led to violent confrontations, resulting in approximately 80 deaths, over 550 injuries, and around 1,200 arrests. Facing mounting public pressure and growing unrest, the government ultimately reversed its decision and reinstated the subsidies, thereby restoring stability. At this point, we'd like to take a brief pause. If you found the video insightful so far, we'd greatly appreciate your support. Hitting the like button helps us reach a wider audience, and sharing your thoughts in the comments has an even greater impact. Thank you for watching. Now let's continue. During the late 1990s, Brazil faced a severe economic crisis and turned to the IMF for assistance in stabilizing its currency and economy. In November 1998, the IMF approved a substantial $41.5 billion aid package contingent on Brazil implementing rigorous austerity measures and structural reforms to address fiscal deficits and restore economic stability. These policies required deep cuts in public spending, increased taxation, and reforms in the public sector. As a result, government funding for essential services, including healthcare, education, and social security, was significantly reduced. This diminished access to crucial services, disproportionately affecting low-income and vulnerable communities. Public dissatisfaction with these measures was profound. Citizens and labor unions accused the IMF of imposing policies that exacerbated poverty and inequality. Nationwide protests and strikes erupted, with critics arguing that the strict focus on fiscal austerity stifled economic growth and social progress, leading to heightened unemployment and social unrest. Despite these challenges, some analysts contend that these structural reforms were necessary for Brazil's long-term economic stability. They argue that these measures helped curb hyperinflation, restore investor confidence, and create a foundation for future economic growth. Brazil's early repayment of its IMF loans in 2005, under the leadership of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is often cited as evidence of the country's regained financial independence and improved economic standing. However, the debate over the effectiveness of IMF-imposed austerity continues. While these policies may have stabilized macroeconomic conditions, they impose significant social costs, highlighting the challenge of balancing economic reforms with social welfare. Brazil's experience underscores the complex interplay between international financial aid, domestic policy, and the socio-economic difficulties faced by its people. In May 1981, Morocco faced mounting economic challenges, including a widening budget deficit and increasing external debt. In an effort to address these issues, King Hassan II's administration entered into an agreement with the International Monetary Fund that required the implementation of austerity measures, most notably the removal of subsidies on essential food products such as flour, sugar, oil, milk, and butter. These subsidy cuts led to immediate and sharp price increases. Flour prices rose by 40%, sugar by 50%, oil by 28%, milk by 14%, and butter by 76%. The soaring cost of basic goods triggered widespread public anger, culminating in the Casablanca bread riots on May 29, 1981. Thousands of impoverished citizens took to the streets, venting their frustration on symbols of wealth, including banks, grocery stores, and luxury vehicles. The government reacted with a swift and forceful crackdown, deploying police and military forces to suppress the protests. Official records reported 66 deaths, while opposition sources suggested the actual toll was as high as 637, with many of the casualties being young people from low-income neighborhoods. The violent suppression of the protests left lasting social and political scars. The events of 1981 underscored the risks associated with implementing austerity policies in societies reliant on state-subsidized goods. Moreover, the unrest highlighted the tensions between economic adjustments mandated by international financial institutions and Morocco's domestic socio-economic realities. This period remains a pivotal moment in the country's history, reflecting the delicate balance between economic policy and social stability. In February 1989, Venezuela was plunged into an economic crisis due to plummeting oil revenues and rising external debt. In response, President Carlos Andrés Pérez implemented IMF-backed austerity measures, collectively known as El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn, which aimed to stabilize the economy through structural adjustments. the introduction of these measures provoked widespread public outrage. On February 27, 1989, protests erupted in Guarinas, near Caracas, in response to increases in public transportation fares. The unrest quickly spread to the capital and other urban centers, escalating into mass demonstrations, riots, and looting in what came to be known as El Caracazo. President Perez declared a state of emergency and suspended constitutional rights, authorizing security forces to restore order. This response led to a brutal crackdown, with official reports citing 277 fatalities, though independent sources estimate the death toll ranged from 2,000 to 5,000, mostly due to security force actions. The violent suppression of the protests significantly eroded public confidence in traditional political leadership, ultimately paving the way for the rise of Hugo Chavez. Chavez, then a lieutenant colonel involved in a failed coup attempt in 1992, capitalized on the widespread discontent to win the presidency in 1998. El Caracazo remains a defining moment in Venezuela's history, reflecting deep-seated societal divisions and the destabilizing consequences of sudden economic adjustments. Now let's examine why BRICS nations and other Global South countries remain dissatisfied with the IMF. The IMF has faced intense criticism from developing nations for its lending policies and the economic measures it enforces. Several key concerns have been raised. Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the IMF promoted SAPs that prioritized austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization. While these programs were intended to stabilize economies and encourage growth, critics argue that they often resulted in reduced public spending on critical services like healthcare and education, disproportionately affecting low-income populations. Additionally, the shift toward export-driven economies left many nations vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets, exacerbating poverty and inequality. Erosion of sovereignty. IMF loans frequently come with stringent conditions that compel borrowing nations to implement specific economic policies. Critics argue that this undermines national sovereignty by limiting governments' ability to craft policies suited to their unique socio-economic circumstances. Many contend that these interventions prioritize the interests of wealthy creditor nations over the needs of borrowing countries. Governance bias. The IMF's governance structure has been criticized for favoring developed economies. Voting power is determined by a quota system based on financial contributions, giving wealthier nations greater influence over decision-making. This structure has resulted in persistent disparities in representation, reinforcing perceptions of the IMF as a neo-colonial institution. Debt burden. The IMF's approach to debt restructuring has been accused of offering insufficient relief while failing to address the root causes of financial crises. Many debtor nations find themselves trapped in cycles of borrowing and repayment, which stifle sustainable development and perpetuate dependency on external financial assistance. Impact on social services. The IMF's emphasis on fiscal consolidation often necessitates cuts to public spending on crucial services, such as healthcare and education, exacerbating social inequalities and undermining long-term development. These critiques highlight the fraught relationship between the IMF and the Global South, underscoring the need for reforms that promote inclusive growth while respecting national sovereignty. BRICS nations are actively working to establish new financial mechanisms as alternatives to traditional Western-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Their goal is to enhance financial independence and reduce reliance on the US dollar in global transactions. One of their key initiatives, the New Development Bank, NDB, was founded in 2015 to provide financing for infrastructure and sustainable development projects within BRICS countries and other emerging economies. With an initial authorized capital of $100 billion, the NDB is designed to complement existing financial institutions while offering funding without the restrictive conditions often associated with the IMF. This structure grants member states greater flexibility in pursuing their economic and development goals. In addition to the NDB, BRICS introduced the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, in 2015. This initiative was developed to provide financial support through liquidity and precautionary instruments, particularly in response to short-term balance of payments challenges. With a total capital of $100 billion, the CRA serves as a financial safety net for BRICS members, offering an alternative to IMF assistance programs. More recently, during the 16th BRICS Summit in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, member states advanced several proposals to strengthen financial cooperation and reduce their dependence on Western-controlled economic structures. Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed the creation of a BRICS grain exchange, a platform designed to stabilize food prices and enhance food security among member nations. By facilitating direct trade in agricultural commodities, this initiative aims to reduce reliance on global exchanges that are often influenced by Western financial institutions. While the proposal gained support, experts anticipate that significant groundwork will be required before such an exchange becomes operational. BRICS leaders have also advocated for the development of a unified cross-border payment system to facilitate trade among member nations while reducing dependence on the US dollar. This includes the establishment of BRICS Pay, a decentralized payment messaging system intended to enable transactions in local currencies. By encouraging settlements in national currencies, BRICS hopes to strengthen financial sovereignty and contribute to a more balanced and multipolar international monetary system. A broader analysis of BRICS nations and other Global South economies reveals growing dissatisfaction with the traditional financial institutions that currently dominate global economic governance. Many countries view institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization, WTO, as outdated and ill-suited to the realities of the modern economic landscape. Several key issues fuel this discontent and the push for alternatives. One major concern is the opaque nature of decision-making processes within these institutions. Member nations often struggle to fully understand or influence policies that directly impact their economies, fostering a sense of exclusion and mistrust. The governance structures of institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization inherently favor wealthier nations, with voting power largely determined by financial contributions. As a result, emerging economies and nations in the Global South remain marginalized, often subject to policies that do not align with their unique economic challenges and priorities. Additionally, the rigid frameworks imposed by these institutions limit the ability of nations to implement policies suited to their specific economic and social contexts. Structural adjustment programs, for instance, have historically prioritized austerity and privatization, frequently resulting in increased poverty and inequality. These one-size-fits-all economic prescriptions often fail to account for local realities, leading to economic instability rather than sustainable growth. In response to these challenges, BRICS nations and other Global South economies are actively working to reshape global financial governance by establishing alternative institutions such as the New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. These initiatives aim to foster more equitable representation, enhance financial autonomy, and implement policies that better reflect the diverse economic landscapes of emerging markets. Furthermore, the development of initiatives such as the BRICS Grain Exchange and a unified cross-border payment system exemplifies a commitment to reducing reliance on Western-dominated financial frameworks and promoting a more inclusive and cooperative global financial environment. That concludes today's video. We sincerely appreciate your time and engagement. If you found this content insightful or thought-provoking, we would be grateful for your support. Liking the video and subscribing helps us grow our community and continue delivering informative content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.